We just going to pretend like it's a whole new day or what?
Should I grow a mustache really quick? Welcome to an all-new edition of the D3 Datacast, brought to you by us in the same clothes you saw us wearing in the previous episode. Last time we took a deep dive into those first-round matchups. This time we're zooming out of the bracket a little bit to take a look at not just who the favorites are in the first round, but who are those favorites to advance to the second weekend, to make it to Fort Wayne, to win it all. We're talking overall bracket odds today.
Yeah, Zach, we love math and we love computers. We only like basketball a little bit. So this episode is for us to talk about the number side of the game rather than just the basketball side of the game.
All right, let's jump right into our first quadrant here. Of course, with our number one overall seed, that's Trinity, Connecticut. We talked about how they're heavy favorites against Cuca in the first round, but they're heavy favorites to make it out of that opening weekend pod 91.3% of the time in our tournament simulations. And they're heavy favorites to get to Fort Wayne. Of course, we're not talking about Final Four making it to Fort Wayne this year with the modified schedule due to the combined championship. That'll happen for that Elite Eight round. So 86.1% chance for Trinity, Connecticut to win in the Sweet 16 to advance to the Sweet 16. Matt, remember a while back we had that episode, Can We Say That? And one of the things we discussed was, can we say that the race is really Trinity, Connecticut against the field? We can't quite say that based on these tournament odds, but it's getting pretty close because the computer likes Trinity, Connecticut to win the championship 43.5% of the time, just below kind of that 50% threshold that would make it a true Trinity, Connecticut versus the field type situation.
Yeah, one of the interesting things when you look at bracket odds like this is there's usually two factors at play. One is how good is the team in question, and two is what path do they have to get to each round indicated, right? So if you're playing a difficult team sooner than anticipated, you might show lower odds, not just because you're a better or worse team, but just because you have a more difficult path here. Trinity right off the bat has the quote unquote easiest game of the whole tournament where they're 99.8% favorites here to win. So right there, that's, an easy, well, I'm going to say it now and then look stupid, easy advancement into the second round. So that's just one thing at play here. And I will caveat, yesterday's episode had first round odds that will maybe slightly different from these. When I do this, I'm just kind of doing neutral site odds for all these, even though we know specifically where some of these games are played and future will be played. But just to make it simple, I'm doing neutral court odds. So that's maybe the difference that you'll see in some of those there. But yeah, you're seeing Trinity, over 50-50 to get to that championship game even. So really strong favorites. And it's no surprise that our computer has seen them as not overwhelming favorites the whole season, because I think Randolph-Macon, they kind of swapped back and forth in some of the last few weeks, but at least as one of the top two teams all season long, right from the preseason on through conference tournaments.
And in the previous episode, we talked about Babson St. Joseph, Maine being a tough draw for Trinity, Connecticut, regardless of who gets through as a second round opponent. But we don't really see that manifest in showing up as lower odds to advance than you might expect for a number one overall seed.
Yeah, it doesn't change it too crazy. I think that's partially because Trinity is so highly rated by our computer.
You definitely see
so
the
good.
strength. Yep, you see the strength of their rating.
That even against two other top 25 teams in the computer's mind, they're still heavy favorites. Yeah.
Okay, let's go down there where Redlands has to go to Hood, despite them being the 16 overall seed, Hood being the 17 overall seed. But the computer still likes Redlands as the favorite to come out of that opening weekend pod. 53.5% of the time, just 28.6% of the time for Hood, and then kind of the remaining bit split between the those two teams' first round opponent. But really, you see Redlands overall bracket odds drop once you hit that projected matchup with Trinity, Connecticut.
Yeah, that would be a really fun game against Trinity, just with Trinity's defense and Redlands' pressure and everything. But yeah, that Redlands, that Hood pod there, Redlands is not only the computer's favorite team there, but they also have the easier matchup, again, in the computer's eyes. So that really stokes their first round odds. And that's a big boon then for the second round, is just they're more likely to get there than Hood is in the first place. And then if they potentially do have that matchup, the computer likes Redlands enough that they're over 50% favored then to win in that second round game.
Okay, let's go to the bottom half of this bracket here. We got Catholic, pretty decent favorite over WestCon. Tufts as the host is the favorite, not surprisingly, to get out of that opening weekend pod. About 60% of the time compared to any of the other three teams in that pod, 40% of the time. Um, and then even looking beyond as we kind of include that Wesleyan pod, Tufts is seen as the favorite there. The number 9 overall seed in NPI Tufts compared to Wesleyan, the number 8 overall seed, but a slight preference for Tufts actually in the computer ratings.
Yeah, and really, really closely grouped there. Tufts number 4 by the computer, Wesleyan number 6. So even that's kind of a flip compared to their NPI rank. Tufts, yeah, seen as the slight favorite over Wesleyan to get to the Sweet 16. And look, we talked about it in yesterday's episode, right? The potential path for a team like Wesleyan if they were to get to the Final Four, right? They might have to play Tufts and then play Trinity. So we might get that NESCAC. I mean, that's what the computer is saying is more likely to happen, which makes sense given the seeding, kind of being like the 1, the 2, and the 3 in this pod. So we might see those NESCAC matchups there to get to that Elite Eight.
Yeah, those 3 NESCACs all have the 3 highest odds, there to get to the Elite 8 round there
Fort Wayne.
in Fort Wayne. Matt, just before we leave this quadrant, I quickly looked back at this episode from last year when Trinity Connecticut also entered the tournament as the computer's number 1 team, just to see what their championship odds were at the start of the tournament, because of course they went from number 1 overall uh, team according to the computer all the way to being our national champions. It was 28.6% a year ago.
Okay.
So that just kind of gives some context to how strong that 43.5% number is there.
Were they one or was NYU one? I know they were top 2 in the championship game, but
They were number 1.
okay, cool.
Okay, Matt, anything else here jump out at you as you look at kind of the odds distribution before we move on to the next quadrant?
Just that we're kind of obviously highlighting the most likely in each potential matchup, right? So when you get to the first game, then the first pod, then the Sweet 16 round, and the Elite Eight, you can see Trinity highlighted across the board, right? We called this out. They're the favorite in every round. They're the favorite to win the championship. So you won't see every quadrant have a highlight like this, but they're kind of the overwhelming favorite and not surprising for the number
Yeah.
1 overall seed.
Okay, let's move down to the Mary Washington quadrant. Mary Washington, this is the quadrant um, built around them, but you mentioned those highlights. Look at the highlights; they are the favorite here to reach the semifinals. 35.2% of the time. Um, you look at the next highlighting row that goes across. Gustavus Adolphus is kind of the favorite out of that bottom half to meet up with Mary Washington. Um, and not surprisingly, we see all of the pod hosts as the favorites to get out of that opening weekend.
Yeah. Yeah, and Mary Washington. So again, we've seen now the 2 number 1 seeds in the first 2 quadrants as being the favorites to get to those Final Four spots. That's not surprising. But what is maybe surprising is in both of these quadrants, we've seen the number 3 seed as slight favorites over the number 2 seed. This one's pretty close. 38% for Gustavus and 32% for Chicago. But I think the difference, if I can jump down to the bottom for now, Zach, is
Yep.
is I think we're seeing a difference in the path there between
Yeah.
what
Yep.
Chicago might have to face and what Gustavus has to face. The computer sees Chicago as a stronger team than Gustavus, but just looking at the Bethany Lutheran matchup, first of all, that seems like a lighter matchup than Chicago has to face with Penn State Barron. We talked yesterday about that being a sneaky good team in Penn State Barron, so that's not a gimme putt. And then even in the next game, pretty comparable between either Platteville and Otterbein or Stevens Point and Mary Hardin Baylor. So just really, I think what we're really seeing is even the difficulty that the first round might present. If Chicago gets through and Gustavus Adolphus gets through even that first game, I think you'd start to see the odds shift more into Chicago's favor, probably.
Yeah, the computer still likes Chicago just as a team generally over Gustavus Adolphus, but with it being lower odds that they would advance to the Sweet 16, they end up with lower odds overall to win in the Sweet 16, right? You have to be there to win the game.
Yep. Right.
So if your odds are lower to get there, that's going to hurt your odds. Now, when we take an updated look at this a week from now, where we're kind of resetting these odds from that Sweet 16 point out, if those two teams are there, in that head-to-head matchup, very likely, depending on how how they perform and how the computer ratings shift, but likely to see Chicago as a favorite in
Yeah.
that head-to-head matchup. It's just the computer sees the path to that point as a little bit less certain.
Yep. Another interesting thing in this view, we talked yesterday about the potential run Amherst could have, or what we think of them and what their season could mean. Yeah, they could lose to WPI in that first round, but they have decent odds. That you look at their percent to win the Sweet 16, so that would be getting to Fort Wayne in the Elite Eight. That's almost as good, 15.8, compared to UW La Crosse's 16.2. So another host, even given the path that Amherst have, that's just the strength that the computer thinks that the Mammoths have this year. Will be fascinating to see, if they can secure, maybe an upset win of getting through that first pot or something. What could actually happen there?
All right, let's drop to the Emory quadrant, where we see, no surprise, Emory is the number five team overall in the computer rating, strong odds to advance into the second weekend and beyond. Matt Montclair State, the favorite to win their second round game to move on. Not surprised there. Illinois Wesleyan, the favorite, no surprise there. But we talked about this Endicott pod in the episode yesterday. Look at how even some of those
Yeah.
odds are, where actually the computer sees Cortland as the favorite to come out of that pod 38.1% of the times. Host Endicott just second there, 37.1. But even despite that head-to-head between Franklin and Marshall at Cortland, like, we know one of those teams is going to lose in the first round. So, and again, going back to, you have to be in the round to win the round. Franklin and Marshall still with 21.8% odds to win in the second round.
Yeah, that pot is wide open. If you're looking for kind of a sexy pick in your bracket challenge, maybe consider Cortland there. Not to say that, like, look, they're all basically even. Like, there's three pretty close teams. Not to say that Endicott won't or can't win that, but if you're upset minded, then maybe look at Cortland there. That'd be a really interesting one, for sure.
And I tell you who would really be interested in that pod, going a different way, is potentially Illinois Wesleyan,
Yeah.
who, if chalk holds, would be flying to Endicott for that standalone Sweet 16. But if there's an upset in the Endicott pod, um,
Maybe. Yeah.
depending on what happens potentially with hosting on the women's side and their women's basketball team advancing, that could be set up for Illinois Wesleyan to host that standalone Sweet 16
Yeah.
as suddenly the higher seeded team if Endicott is not able to survive the opening weekend.
And here our third quadrant and our third number 3 seed, who is kind of the favorite to come into to win that Sweet 16 round, right? So we've now seen, when it comes to kind of that potential 2-3 matchup, or at least that weekend of that matchup, the 3 seed is seen as slightly more likely than the 2 seed to get through.
But interesting, similarly like we saw with lacrosse, still the favorite to come out of that weekend, but the field has just as good of a shot, right?
Yeah.
Actually, the field is slightly above 50%. Um, and we talked about how fun that John Carroll Grinnell matchup is. Grinnell, even with a 15.8% number there to come out of that
Yeah.
opening weekend.
Yep. Yeah, really good. This whole quadrant, right? There's a lot of different ways things could go. Just the math looks really interesting. It's the favorites are favorites for a reason, but there's obviously upsets can happen, and some of these matchups, the computer thinks are more even than maybe the seeding thinks. So crazy things could happen there.
Yeah, and it just go all the way over to, percentage to win Elite Eight. You see a number of teams in or around that 10%
Mm-hmm.
mark, right? We got Emory, Roanoke, Montclair State, Illinois Wesleyan, Cortland,
Portland, yeah.
right? And then, and that's not even considering, one of those other top eight protected
Yeah.
seed at Endicott down at 6.3, right? So it's just going to be interesting. Things are really going to shift. depending on who actually gets through. Because what I'm seeing in here, especially as you go further to the right, is just a lot of uncertainty built in as to who is actually going to
Yeah.
advance in the rounds before.
Right. And some good odds, right? You think, okay, 5% odds for John Carroll or 6% odds for Endicott, that's pretty low. But when you get into that's to reach the Final Four, right? When you look at it across the whole bracket, across the whole country, that's still reasonable odds to get through, right?
Should we move on?
All right.
All
Next one.
right. St. Thomas quadrant. Here we finally see that other highlighted cell over in the odds to win the Final Four, the semifinal matchup. So let's just start there with Randolph Macon. No surprise, the computer favored the number one team, Trinity Connecticut, um, as the other highlighted team in that field. Randolph Macon as the computer's number two team is highlighted as the other highlighted in that field. So the computer is liking the odds most likely of a Trinity Connecticut Randolph Macon final. St. Thomas, um, Texas is the number one seed in this quadrant, but just the number 13 team according to the computer. So by the time you get to a potential St. Thomas, Texas, Randolph Macon matchup, Randolph Macon is preferred. And again, going back to the path, the computer with the preference for Randolph Macon with as the number two team versus St. Thomas as the number 13 team is just much more confident in Randolph Macon moving through that path
Yeah.
to set them up to have the ability to win in those future rounds.
Yeah. Yeah, and a couple interesting things looking at this quadrant in the Christopher Newport pod. Mount Union and Christopher Newport is seen as the two heavy favorites, and look 43 to 42%, like a really even split there to get out of that pod to win the second weekend or the second round to get to the second weekend. That looks really fascinating to me. That St. Thomas, Texas, even though they're the number one in this quadrant, and still 55% to win that pod, to win that weekend. Still, the Trinity and Whitworth winner looks like they have a pretty good chance. They're 26 and 15%, so kind of anyone's game there as well. And then kind of the same in Wash U as well. Whitewater and Loras both adding up to be about 40%. Wash U only 51% to survive the first weekend. That's still pretty strong odds, but for hosts, anytime that they're kind of 50-50 or worse, then you start thinking about like what do upsets potentially look like there.
All right, so if we just kind of summarize based on these overall bracket odds, or the team ratings, the team strength, combined with the potential path through the bracket, let's talk about those favorites to advance to the Elite Eight in Fort Wayne. That would be Trinity, Connecticut, Tufts, Mary Washington, Gustavus Adolphus, Emory, Illinois Wesleyan, St. Thomas, and Randolph Macon.
That'd be interesting. That's a lot of favorites, but in three of those quadrants, right, it's the three instead of the two. It's only in this last St. Thomas quadrant that Randolph Macon would be expected to get to expected, right? Not expected, but the favorite to get to the Elite Eight round. And I think they're the only two seed as well to get favored to get to the Final Four. So computer obviously likes a lot of chalk. I think that's a testament to how well overall NPI, at least especially at the top, maps on to efficiency ratings. I think the differences lie more in the middle. And we talked about, again, in yesterday's episode, how the tournament was pretty properly seeded, overall seeded very well. We also talked about how NPI and our computer ratings are trying to do two different things. They're different projects. But I think there's pretty large agreement on the whole between those two types of things. The differences are more on the margins and are more infrequent.
So let's talk about overall championship odds, Matt, because it's interesting. We talked about Trinity, Connecticut being the overall favorite with 43.5% odds. Randolph Macon takes up a healthy chunk of that remaining at 33.4, right? So that's 76.9% between Randolph Macon and Trinity, Connecticut. Any gut reactions or anything to that?
I mean, I would take the field if you're giving me the odds of 70, whatever the odds ratio between like 77 and the rest would be. I would say that the rest is probably more than 1/3 likely to do that. So it seems high. It seems high.
So, yeah, no other individual team even hits 5%. Mary Washington at 4.9% would be the next best. As I flip back through kind of a smattering of some of these other odds to win it all. Tufts 2.9, Wesleyan 1.3, Gustavus Adolphus 1.3, Chicago 1.4, 1.0 for Roanoke. We talked about the difficult
Yeah.
path and kind of the unfair spot for them and for Emory, really.
And if it was
Um,
a pure coin flip, each team would have about 1.5%. So that always looks low when you say like only a 1 or 2%, but that's kind of what would be expected on a true coin flip type of a thing.
yeah. So not a lot of championship odds distribution there.
Yeah. But things will change in a hurry after the
Right.
first weekend. Of course, if a bunch of the favorites win, then they're still big favorites. But we talked about some of the paths. You might see a U Chicago if they're 75% favored to beat Penn State Barron, and if they do, then their odds jump a whole bunch in subsequent rounds as well, right? Because they actually made it and they're actually a good team. So we'll see things shift a little bit. It'll be interesting to reset this picture after the round of 32, heading into the Sweet 16, to see how things have shifted in some of those regards.
And some of this is just very reflective of how separated Trinity, Connecticut, and Randolph-Macon actually are in the efficiency ratings that you can find at d3datacast.com. If you go to our site, there's a top bar where you can find the efficiency ratings. Right, Trinity, Connecticut enters the tournament with an adjusted efficiency margin of plus 42.8. Randolph Macon is at plus 40.4. The number three team is Mary Washington, where it's over a 10-point drop to
Yeah.
plus 29.9. Right, so that's really what is driving uh, the disparity in those championship odds for Trinity, Connecticut, Randolph Macon compared to the rest of the field.
Yeah, even in like a number two versus a number three matchup, the computer sees a little bit of a mismatch there.
Right. So let's just say Randolph Macon to number three, Mary Washington, let's call it a 10-point drop. If you look at the next 10-point drop from Mary Washington, that gets you down to about number 24.
Yeah.
Right. So that gap from two to three is about the same as from 3 to 24.
Yeah. So is that real or is that computer nonsense? We'll have to kind of find out.
Opinions are all over the map on that, I'm sure. All right, Matt. Anything else to be said about the tournament odds? I mean, like you said, it's team dependent, it's path dependent, and as soon as that first round is over, all of a sudden the path changes because we have some certainty as to who's through, who they're going to play, and so that's why it's always fun to get through that opening weekend. We'll take another look at this type of view, resetting the deck for that standalone Sweet 16, that Sweet 16 weekend, and see how the odds shift from there.
And I think we need to underscore, maybe we talked about this, I'm not sure if we specifically stated it. Just because the computer favors teams, what it's also saying is it's expecting a bunch of these teams to actually lose. Did you say the number that we calculated in yesterday's
Uh,
episode?
I don't think we talked. No, we didn't talk about it, right? So if you're looking at kind of, we talked about the win probabilities, right? So if you add up the win probabilities for all the teams that are above 50% and the win probabilities for all the teams that are below 50%, the computer is saying that those teams above would be expected to go about 24-8,
Yeah.
right? So the only upset would be if there were no upsets,
Yes.
right? So
Right.
so while there may be underdogs, there is no expectation that all those underdogs are going to lose. In fact, what the overall win probabilities say is that if you put all the teams in one bucket that had win probabilities for that first round game over 500 or over 50%, and all another bucket with all the teams that were below 50%. Well, you take 24 names out of the above 50% bucket and 8 names out of the below 50% bucket, and that is basically the expectation
Yeah.
according to those win probabilities.
Yeah. So we're expecting to get 24. The computer's expecting to get 24 right on that first day. Um, and we'll see what happens. Yeah.
All right, will be fun to watch the games. I'm sick of talking about these games in terms of what could happen or what might happen. Let's just leave it here. Let's get to Friday and let's see what does happen.
Thank you to all the folks who've supported us on Patreon. We couldn't do these episodes and all these tournament episodes in a row without you, so thank you so much. Join us at patreon.com/D3 Datacast. Games on Friday, Zach. Cannot wait. Good job, team.